Okay, this first little segment is about the difference between a clause and a phrase, because in order to understand what we're about to move into, you have to be able to understand a clause and recognize one when you see it. So let's begin by talking about the difference between a clause and a phrase. Both of them are groups of words. Group of words, group of words. Okay. The difference is a clause will always have a subject and a verb. Okay. So when we look for a clause, we're looking for a group of words that has both a subject and a verb. Let's look, for example, we will go, subject, verb. Girl walked, subject, verb. But in these phrases, you notice we have, well, here's a prepositional phrase, here's another prepositional phrase, here's a subject with a prepositional phrase that could become a sentence, could become a clause, but right now all it is a noun clause. Here's a verb phrase that has a verb but no subject. So all of these are simply phrases. None of these could stand alone as a clause because it doesn't have both a subject and a verb. That's the first thing you have to understand about the difference between clauses and phrases before we move into our new unit on adverb and adjective clauses. The next thing you have to understand is the difference between a dependent clause and an independent clause. Now, what dependent and independent clauses have in common is that they all have subjects and verbs. Remember, all clauses have both a subject and a verb. If it's lacking one or the other, it's not a clause, it's a phrase. But even if you have a subject and a verb, that does not mean that the clause can stand alone as a sentence. And that's the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause. Independent clauses can stand alone as a sentence. Dependent clauses cannot stand alone as a sentence. Okay? So let's look at some independent clauses. I went to the store for milk. I went to the store for milk. A couple of prepositional phrases. You can hear that it's a sentence. I went to the store for milk. You can even hear your voice drop at the end. You can tell that that is a complete standalone sentence. She loves to ski. Again, a complete thought. You can even hear in your voice that when we get to the end of that clause, our voice drops. It's complete. But a dependent clause will still have a subject and a verb. Look at these dependent clauses. I went to the store for milk, subject, verb, but when we tack on when I went to the store for milk, you can hear that it's not complete. She loves to ski would be an independent clause if we didn't have because tacked on. But once we say because she loves to ski, you can hear that it's not a complete thought. Here's another one. Whoever is elected governor, well, we have a subject, we have a verb, but we don't have a complete thought. Whoever is elected governor, what? We want to know the rest of the thought. So again, we have a subject, we have a verb, but in none of these three cases do we have a complete thought. So these are dependent clauses, not independent clauses. Your ability to do well in this next section is going to hinge on your ability to recognize a dependent clause when you see one. They will function as adjectives, adverbs, and nouns, dependent clauses. We're going to start with these two, adverbs and adjectives. Those are in the next section of your textbook, and your next test will include adverbial and adjectival dependent clauses. And then test 3 will include nominal. So these two are on test 2. This one is on test 3. Another thing you have to understand before we move into this next unit of our class is the difference between kinds of sentences. And some of you will remember this from, goodness, elementary school, middle school, but we all need a refresher. So let's think about the difference between a simple sentence, a compound sentence, and a complex sentence. A simple sentence has one independent clause. That is, it has a subject, a verb, and it can stand alone as a sentence, and that's it. It might have a compound subject and or a compound verb, but it still has only one clause. Here we have a sentence with a compound subject, Helen and I, so we have two subjects, and if you remember, that would be diagrammed like this, Helen and I. But then our verb is also compound, went to the store and bought milk. So we would have a compound verb as well. So Helen and I went and bought. Okay. This one would be a 7, right? Bought milk. This one, whoops, milk. This one would be went to store these, so that would just be a 6. But we have here only one clause, because even though we have two subjects and two verbs, both subjects go with both verbs. Okay? There's a relationship between Helen and went and bought and I went and bought. One clause. Okay? All right. With a compound sentence, you're going to have two or more independent clauses held together in one of these three ways. You might have a coordinating conjunction holding your two independent clauses together. Here is an independent clause, and here is an independent clause. And notice that we are holding those two independent clauses together by one of our 7 coordinating conjunctions: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. I really recommend that you memorize this list. It's worth knowing these 7 coordinating conjunctions. It's easy enough to remember with this acronym, Fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. If you have two independent clauses, one way to hold them together grammatically is to put a comma and a coordinating conjunction, which is in this case and, to hold those two independent clauses together. Another way to hold together two independent clauses is simply to use a semicolon. And another way to hold together two independent clauses is either a semicolon or a period. It could be a period or a semicolon plus a conjunctive adverb. Okay. If you had a period, of course, the conjunctive adverb would have started with a capital letter. It's the only difference. But again, we have two independent clauses here. We have two independent clauses here. We have two independent clauses here. So when you have two or more independent clauses held together in a single sentence, we call it a compound sentence. So far here, we're looking at simple sentences and compound sentences. A complex sentence, on the other hand, is going to have at least one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. That's what constitutes a complex sentence. Because I needed milk, well, that's a clause because it has a subject and it has a verb. Here's another clause. I went, has a subject, has a verb, but only one of these two clauses is independent. Which of these two clauses can stand alone as a sentence? Because I needed milk, or I went to the store? Right, I went to the store is the independent clause because it's the one that can stand alone. Because I needed milk is a clause. It has a subject and a verb, but it cannot stand alone as a sentence. Therefore, we call it a dependent clause. So here we have in this sentence one independent clause and one dependent clause. Okay? Let me erase that one and let's look at another one. I'm going to erase it just so I don't have my ink bleeding onto one another. Officer gave a ticket to the woman who was speeding. Well, here we have two clauses. Officer gave ticket, there's the direct object, and then here's another clause, who was speeding. So we have two clauses. The officer gave a ticket to the woman who was speeding. That's one. And notice the other one is inside the larger one. But who was speeding is also a clause. Okay? So which one of those two clauses can stand alone? The bigger one, the officer gave a ticket, that one, or who was speeding? Obviously, who was speeding is the dependent clause. It's the group of words that has a subject and a verb but cannot stand alone as a sentence. The officer gave a ticket, that clause could stand alone. I could say the officer gave a ticket to the woman, period. Or I can say the officer gave a ticket to the woman who was speeding, period. But that clause, whose subject is officer and whose verb is gave, can stand alone. Therefore, it, the larger one here, is the independent clause. Okay? Let's do another one. We will bake cookies, that's your direct object here, right? After we have bought milk. Well, look, subject, verb, direct object, subject, verb, direct object. How many clauses do we have? We must have two clauses because we have two combinations of subjects and verbs that don't crisscross. Remember, when we had a compound subject, both subjects went with the verb. Or in the case of our example earlier, both subjects went with both verbs. We had a compound subject and a compound verb. But here, this we goes with this will bake, and this we goes with this have bought. There is no cross-pollination here. So here we have a clause, and here we have a clause. Which of these can stand alone? We will bake cookies, or after we have bought milk? Right, we will bake cookies can stand alone. That's your independent clause. And after we have bought milk is your dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. Okay, let's do another one. Before you go to the store is a clause. I will make a list is a clause. There's our subject, there's our verb, there's our subject, there's our verb. We have two clauses, but only one of these clauses can stand alone. This is our independent clause, and this is our dependent clause. And then finally we have, and I want to show you that sometimes words that make a dependent clause can also serve as prepositions. How will you know if this word is making this clause dependent or if it's simply acting as a preposition? You can tell because if it is functioning to make this a dependent clause, you will have to have a subject and a verb after it. Here we have only the noun noon, so this is a prepositional phrase, whereas this is a clause. What makes it a clause? The subject and the verb.